He wasn't taken. There was no forced entry, no sign of a struggle, no witness who saw anything suspicious. Instead, he left a note, a calm, deliberate note. And in that note, one word was underlined twice. Lost. Not once. Twice. A 17-year-old boy walks out of his home in Minnesota, takes his family's van, writes what looks like a simple explanation, and then disappears forever. No confirmed sighting. No body. No clear answer. Just a second letter, a missing weapon with no ammunition, and a series of strange phone calls that would haunt his family for months. This is the disappearance of Christopher Matthew Kerze. Before we go deeper, take 1 second. Thousands of people watch these cases without subscribing. If you don't subscribe right now, YouTube may never show you this case again. We upload cases like this every single day, and every single one matters. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. Because stories like Christopher's deserve to be seen. Christopher Matthew Kerze was 17 years old. He lived with his parents in Eagan, Minnesota, a quiet suburban area. The kind of place where nothing like this is supposed to happen. Christopher wasn't known as a troublemaker. He wasn't constantly in conflict. He wasn't someone people described as unstable or unpredictable. To everyone around him, he was normal, a teenager with a routine, a life that moved forward in the quiet, expected way most lives do. School, home, family, nothing extreme, nothing alarming, at least nothing obvious. But sometimes, the most unsettling cases begin like this. No chaos, no warning, just normal, until suddenly, it isn't. April 20th, 1990. That morning, Christopher stayed home from school. He told his parents he was sick. It wasn't suspicious. It wasn't unusual. Teenagers miss school all the time. Sometimes they're genuinely ill. Sometimes they just need a day. His parents had no reason to question it. No reason to suspect that this day would be any different from the hundreds that came before it. But while they were gone, Christopher was making a decision. Not a sudden one. Not an emotional reaction. Something planned. Something thought through. Because when his parents returned home later that day, the first thing they noticed was the silence. A different kind of silence. Not the usual quiet of an empty house, but something heavier. Something wrong. Then they noticed something else. The family van was gone. And Christopher was gone. At that moment, there's still a part of you that tries to explain it. Maybe he went out. Maybe he felt better and decided to drive somewhere. Maybe he just needed space. But then, they found the note. Left behind. Carefully written. It said something simple. That something important had come up. That he needed to leave. And that he would be back by 6 p.m. Unless he got lost. That word. Lost. Underlined twice. Not casually. Not accidentally. Underlined deliberately. Like he wanted it to stand out. Like he wanted them to notice it. And the more you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes. Because what does a lost mean in this context? Physically lost? Emotionally lost? Or something else entirely? At that moment, though, it still felt temporary. 6 p.m. came and went. Christopher didn't come back. At first, there's hope. There's always hope. Maybe he's delayed. Maybe something came up. Maybe he'll walk through the door any minute and explain everything. But as the hours passed, that hope started to fade. It turned into concern, then anxiety, then something heavier, something harder to ignore, fear. And then the next day, April 21st, everything changed because the family received another message. This time a letter, mailed from Duluth, Minnesota, far enough away to raise questions, but close enough to still feel connected. The letter was from Christopher, and this time, there was no ambiguity. He admitted he had lied. He hadn't been sick. He stayed home from school intentionally, so he could take the van, so he could leave. That alone changes everything. Because now this isn't confusion. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a plan, a deliberate decision. And then, the words that no parent is ever prepared to read. He said he was going somewhere, and even he didn't know where. To not even I know where. That line alone is chilling, because it suggests something deeper than running away. It suggests disconnection, detachment, a kind of mental state where direction no longer matters. And then came the most devastating part. He wrote that he intended to end his life. He apologized. To his family. To the people he loved. As if he had already made peace with the decision. As if this wasn't a cry for help, but a conclusion. A final step. But even in that moment, something didn't make sense. Because Christopher had taken something with him. A 20-gauge shotgun. A weapon. Something that immediately makes you think, okay, maybe this aligns with what he wrote. Maybe this confirms it. But then, you learn the detail that changes everything. He didn't take any ammunition. No bullets. No shells. Nothing. Think about that carefully. If someone truly planned to end their life, why take a gun? Without the means to use it? Was it symbolic? Was it meant to create a certain impression? Was it a way to mislead? Or did something happen after he left? That changed everything? That question becomes the center of this entire case. Because it introduces doubt. And once doubt enters a case like this, nothing is straightforward anymore. 2 days later, April 22nd, the van was found, abandoned, near Grand Rapids, Minnesota, a remote area, quiet, isolated, the kind of place where someone could disappear without being seen. The vehicle itself told its own story. There was no sign of a struggle, no damage suggesting violence, no immediate evidence of what had happened, just empty, as if it had been driven there, parked, and left behind, like a final marker, a last known location. Search teams were deployed almost immediately. Authorities began combing the area. Volunteers joined in. People searched forests, roads, fields, any place where Christopher could have gone. They looked for footprints, disturbances, anything, but they found nothing. No clothing, no weapon, no trace of Christopher at all. It was as if he had stepped out of that van and vanished into the air. And that's when this case shifts. Because at this point, it stops being just a missing person case and starts becoming something else, something far more unsettling. Because when someone plans to disappear, there are usually signs, patterns, clues. But here, everything feels incomplete. The note suggests intention. The letter suggests finality. But the missing ammunition creates doubt, and that doubt grows stronger with everything that follows. Because Christopher didn't just disappear. His absence started leaving behind echoes, questions that couldn't be answered, and signs that something about this story wasn't as simple as it first appeared. And what happens next would make his family question everything. Not just what happened that day, but whether Christopher was truly gone or still out there, somewhere. And here's the question I want you to think about. Do you believe Christopher truly intended to end his life? Or do you think that note was meant to make people believe something that wasn't true? Comment below. By the time Christopher Matthew Kerze's van was found abandoned near Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the case had already taken a dark turn. A note left behind. A second letter suggesting he intended to end his life. A weapon taken, but with no ammunition. And now, a vehicle, empty, parked in a remote area, with no sign of where he went next. This is where the investigation truly begins. Because up until this point, everything could still be explained. But from here on, nothing makes sense. Authorities moved quickly. Search teams were organized. Volunteers joined in. The area around where the van was found was immediately treated as critical ground. Forests were searched. Paths were tracked. Nearby terrain was combed thoroughly. This wasn't a casual effort. It was intense, focused, driven by one goal: find Christopher. Because if his letter was true, time mattered. Every minute mattered. If he was out there alone, every hour reduced the chances of finding him alive. Searchers looked for everything: footprints, disturbed ground, broken branches, any sign that someone had walked away from the van. But there was nothing. No direction, no clear path, no indication of where he had gone. It was as if the van was the final point. And beyond that, Christopher simply ceased to exist. And that's the first major problem investigators faced. Because even in the most remote disappearances, there are usually signs. People leave traces, even unintentionally. But here, there was nothing. And when a case begins with no physical trail, it becomes exponentially harder to solve. Investigators then turn their attention to the vehicle itself. Because sometimes, the answers aren't outside. They're inside. They examined the van carefully, looking for anything that could indicate what Christopher was thinking, what he was planning, or what may have happened. But again, nothing. No evidence of struggle, no blood, no sign of forced interaction with anyone else. Just a vehicle that had been driven, parked, and abandoned. That detail alone raised a serious question. If Christopher intended to end his life, why park the van neatly? Why leave it in a way that suggests control? Why not drive deeper into isolation? Why not choose a location that ensured he wouldn't be found? Instead, the van was left in a place that could be discovered. And it was discovered. That doesn't feel random. That feels intentional. And that's when investigators began considering the possibility that the van itself was part of the message, a final clue, or perhaps a misdirection. At this point, attention shifted back to the letters, because those letters were the only direct insight into Christopher's state of mind. The first note, the one left at home, it was calm, structured, almost rehearsed. It didn't sound like panic. It didn't sound like emotional collapse. It sounded controlled. And then the second letter, the one from Duluth. That one was heavier, more final, more explicit. It introduced the idea of ending his life. But even that letter had something unusual about it. The phrase, "to not even I know where." That's not typical language. It suggests confusion, but also intention, like someone choosing to remove themselves from everything, without a destination, without a plan to return. But again, there's a contradiction. If this was truly about ending his life, why no ammunition? That detail refuses to disappear. It forces investigators to consider alternative explanations. Was Christopher unsure? Was he conflicted? Did he change his mind? Or was the letter meant to mislead? And that's when the investigation started expanding beyond the obvious. Because once you introduce doubt into a case, you have to consider every possibility, even the uncomfortable ones. Investigators began looking into Christopher's life more closely. His behavior, his relationships, his mindset in the days leading up to April 20th. Because sometimes the answers aren't in the disappearance itself. They're in what happened before it. They spoke to family, friends, people who knew him, trying to identify anything unusual, any change, any sign that something was wrong. But what they found wasn't what they expected. There were no clear indicators of a breakdown, no major conflicts, no obvious trigger, nothing that screamed, "This person is about to disappear." And that makes cases like this even more difficult. Because when there's no clear cause, there's no clear direction for the investigation. And then, something strange began to happen. About a week after Christopher disappeared, his family started receiving phone calls. Not normal calls, strange ones. When they answered, there was noise on the other end. Loud noise, like a party. Voices, movement, but no clear words, no direct communication. And when they tried to speak, the call would end, just like that, disconnected. At first, it could be dismissed. A coincidence, a prank. But then it kept happening, again, and again, and again. And it wasn't just his parents. Christopher's best friend, his neighbor, they started receiving similar calls. Same pattern, same noise, same sudden disconnection. And that's when it stopped being coincidence. Because now, it was a pattern. And patterns in cases like this matter a lot. Christopher's mother became convinced. She believed it was him. She believed her son was on the other end of those calls, that he was trying to reach out, trying to communicate, but couldn't, or wouldn't. Because think about it. If those calls were random, why target his family? Why his close circle? Why repeat the same behavior? And why stop? Because after 6 months, the calls ended. Completely. No more noise. No more hang-ups. Nothing. Just silence. Again. And that silence was just as disturbing as the calls themselves. Because it suggested something had changed. Something had ended. And no one knew what. At this point, the investigation faced multiple competing theories. The first, the one supported by the letter, that Christopher had taken his own life. But that theory has problems. Major ones. No body was ever found. No weapon was ever recovered. No physical evidence supported that conclusion. The second theory, that he disappeared intentionally, that he chose to leave his life behind, start over somewhere else. But again, there are problems. Christopher didn't take money. He didn't prepare for long-term survival. He didn't leave behind a structured plan. And most importantly, why send letters that suggest death if you plan to live? Unless, that was the point, to make people stop looking. The third theory, and perhaps the most unsettling, is that something happened after he left. Something unexpected. Something that wasn't part of the plan. An encounter. An event. Something that changed everything. Because once Christopher left that house, he entered the unknown. And in that unknown, anything could have happened. But here's the truth that makes this case so difficult. There's no evidence to confirm any of these theories. Only questions. And the longer a case goes without answers, the more those questions multiply. Search efforts continued. Posters were distributed. Tips were followed. Leads were investigated. But none of it led anywhere. No confirmed sightings. No credible evidence. Nothing that brought them closer to finding Christopher. It was like chasing something that wasn't there. And yet, the case never truly faded, because there were too many strange elements. The underlined word, the missing ammunition, the abandoned van, the eerie phone calls. Each one adds a layer of mystery. Each one makes it harder to accept a simple explanation. And that's why this case still stands today, unsolved, unanswered, and deeply unsettling, because it forces you to ask a question that doesn't have an easy answer. Was Christopher Kerze trying to disappear? Or was he trying to tell someone something before it was too late? And here's what I want to know from you. Do you think those phone calls were really Christopher trying to reach out? Or do you believe someone else was behind them? Comment below. Time passes. Years go by. But instead of answers, this case only becomes more disturbing. Time is supposed to bring clarity. In most cases, as the years pass, something surfaces. A witness comes forward. Evidence is found. A mistake is corrected. But in the disappearance of Christopher Matthew Kerze, time did something different. It didn't bring answers. It deepened the mystery. And slowly, it began to change the way people understood what might have happened. Because when a case goes quiet, it doesn't mean it's over. It means it's waiting for something to break it open. In the weeks following Christopher's disappearance, the urgency was intense. Search teams had already combed the area where the van was found. Investigators had followed every immediate lead. His family had done everything they could think of. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the reality began to settle in. Christopher was gone, not missing in the temporary sense, but gone in a way that defied explanation. The phone calls had already begun to fade. At first, they had been frequent, disturbing, almost impossible to ignore. But over time, they became less frequent. And then, they stopped entirely. No final call, no explanation, just silence. Again, and that silence changed everything. Because for his family, those calls had been a connection, a possibility, a reason to believe that Christopher might still be alive, that he was out there somewhere, trying to reach them. But when the calls stopped, that hope became harder to hold on to. Not impossible, but fragile. And in cases like this, hope becomes something complicated. It's not just belief, it's endurance. Because every day without answers forces you to choose. Do you keep believing? Or do you begin to accept something you don't want to accept? Christopher's parents refused to give up. They continued searching, continued asking questions, continued pushing for answers. Because for them, this wasn't a case. This was their son. And as the months turned into years, their efforts didn't stop. They expanded. Posters were distributed across wider areas. Information was shared. Tips were followed. Even the smallest lead was taken seriously. Because sometimes, the smallest detail is the one that matters. But in this case, even those details led nowhere. No confirmed sightings. No credible reports. Nothing that could be verified. And that absence of evidence became one of the most defining features of the case. Because it suggested something unsettling. Either Christopher had disappeared in a way that left no trace, or someone had made sure there would be no trace. And that's where the theories began to shift. At first, the focus had been on the letter, on the possibility that Christopher intended to end his life. But as time passed, that theory became harder to accept, because typically, cases like that eventually reach a conclusion. A location is found, evidence surfaces, something confirms what happened. But here, there was nothing, and that nothing started to feel like something intentional, something deliberate. And then there was the issue of the weapon, the shotgun, taken, but never found. No ammunition, no evidence it was ever used. It remained one of the biggest unanswered questions in the case, because it didn't fit cleanly into any theory. Not suicide, not disappearance, not foul play. It just existed as a contradiction. And contradictions in cases like this matter a lot. As the years passed, Christopher's case slowly became one of many. One more name on a list of missing persons. One more face on a poster. But for his family, it never became normal. It never became distant. Because every day without answers is still a day with questions. And those questions don't fade. They grow. They evolve. They become harder to ignore. In 1993, 3 years after Christopher disappeared, something happened that brought his case back into public awareness. A song was released, Runaway Train by Soul Asylum. The music video featured images of missing children, faces, names, stories that hadn't been resolved. Christopher Kerze was one of them. For millions of people watching that video, it was the first time they saw his face, the first time they heard his name. And for his family, it was a moment of both hope and pain, because awareness can help, but it can also remind you of what hasn't been solved. And even with that exposure, even with more people knowing his story, nothing changed. No breakthrough, no major lead, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. Just more time, more waiting, more unanswered questions. Years turned into decades, and still, nothing. But then something unusual happened. In 2004, 14 years after Christopher disappeared, a letter was sent to the Eagan Police Department. Anonymous, no name, no clear origin, just a message. It said something simple, but deeply unsettling, that the police should stop trying to find Christopher, that he would return home when he was ready. Think about that. After 14 years, someone sends a message suggesting that Christopher is alive, that he chose to leave, that he will come back on his own terms. It's the kind of message that can change everything, if it's real. But that's the problem. The letter couldn't be authenticated. There was no way to prove who sent it, no way to verify its truth. And because of that, it became just another piece of the puzzle, another possibility, another question. Was it a hoax? Someone trying to interfere? Or was it real? A glimpse into what actually happened? Because if Christopher was alive, if he had chosen to disappear, then everything about the case changes. The note, the second letter, the abandoned van, the phone calls, all of it becomes part of a different story. A story where Christopher didn't vanish. He left. But that theory has its own problems. Major ones. Because disappearing successfully isn't easy, especially at 17. It requires planning, resources, a support system. And there was no evidence that Christopher had any of those things. No money, no preparation, no clear destination. So how could he survive for years? Without being found, without making contact, without leaving any trace? And that brings the case back to where it always returns. Uncertainty. Because every theory has gaps. Every explanation has contradictions. And no single answer fits all the evidence. In 2016, there was renewed interest in the case. Another missing person case in Minnesota had been solved. And that resolution brought attention back to older cases, including Christopher's. New age-progressed images were created, showing what he might look like as an adult. Posters were updated. Media coverage returned. Interviews were conducted. For a moment, it felt like the case might finally move forward, like something might break through the silence. But once again, nothing. No confirmed sightings. No new evidence. No breakthrough. Just the same questions. Waiting. And that's what makes this case so difficult. Not just the disappearance itself, but what happens after. The years. The waiting. The constant cycle of hope and disappointment. Because every time something new appears, it raises expectations. And every time it leads nowhere. It makes the silence heavier. And yet, the case is still open. Investigators haven't given up. Christopher's family hasn't given up. Because cases like this, they don't end until there's an answer, no matter how long it takes. And now, after decades, one question still remains at the center of everything. Was Christopher Kerze truly lost? Or was he trying to disappear in a way no one could ever reverse? And here's what I want you to think about. Do you believe Christopher is still alive somewhere? Or do you think the truth lies somewhere near where that van was found? Comment below. For more than 3 decades, Christopher Matthew Kerze has existed in a space between answers. Not confirmed dead, not proven alive, just missing. And in cases like this, the most difficult part isn't what you know. It's what you can't prove. Because everything about this case leads somewhere. But nowhere leads to certainty. So now, we ask the hardest question of all. What really happened to Christopher Kerze? Let's start with the first and most obvious theory. The one investigators initially believed. That Christopher intended to end his life. At first glance, it makes sense. He stayed home from school. He left a note. A note that didn't just explain his absence. It hinted at something deeper. Something final. Then came the second letter. Even more direct. More emotional. More final. He apologized. He said goodbye. He described a journey into the unknown. And he took a weapon with him. A shotgun. If you look at just those pieces, it forms a clear narrative. A troubled teenager. A decision. A plan. An ending. But here's where everything begins to break apart. There was no body. No evidence of a suicide. No confirmation of location. Nothing. And in most cases like this, something is eventually found. Even if it takes time, even if it's years later, there is usually closure. But here, there is none. And that absence matters, because it forces us to question the assumption. What if the letters were real, but the intention wasn't carried out? What if Christopher planned something, but changed his mind? What if something interrupted him? That brings us to the second theory, foul play. Because once you remove certainty, you have to consider everything. Christopher left his home alone, drove a family vehicle, ended up far from where he started, and then vanished. No witnesses, no confirmed sightings after the van, no evidence of struggle, but also no evidence of safety. Nothing that proves he made it out of that situation alive. And that's what makes this theory unsettling. Because if something happened to him, it happened without leaving a trace. And that suggests something deliberate, something controlled, something that wasn't random. But here's the problem. There's no suspect, no motive, no connection to anyone who could have harmed him, no indication that he was meeting someone, no signs that he was being followed, no history of conflict that could explain violence. So while foul play is possible, there's nothing to support it, nothing that turns possibility into probability. And that's why this theory remains exactly that, a possibility. Now let's look at the third theory, the one that challenges everything else. That Christopher didn't disappear. He left. On purpose. Think about it. He planned to stay home that day. He created a reason. He took the van. He wrote a note. Not just any note. A note that would delay concern. I'll be back by 6, unless I get lost. That phrase matters. Because it's ambiguous. It explains absence, but doesn't define it. Then the second letter. Sent from a different location. A different tone. More final. More emotional. But also, more deliberate. Because sending that letter required action. Movement. Planning. It wasn't written in the moment. It was written after he had already left. Which means he had time to think. Time to decide. Time to change direction. And that opens up a different possibility. That the letters weren't a goodbye. They were a cover. A way to ensure that no one would look for him immediately. A way to create a narrative. That he had disappeared on his own terms. But if that's true, then the question becomes even more complicated. Why? Why would a 17-year-old choose to vanish completely? Leave behind family, friends, everything familiar, and never return? Because disappearing like that isn't easy. Or something happened to him. You're forced to take a position. You're forced to decide what you think is more likely. And now, I want to hear from you. So here's what I want to know. 1. Do you believe Christopher intended to end his life or changed his mind? 2. Do you think the phone calls were really him or someone else? 3. Was the anonymous letter a real clue or a cruel hoax? 4. Could a 17-year-old successfully disappear and never be found? 5. Which is more disturbing, a planned disappearance or an untraceable crime? Drop your answers in the comments. Because this case doesn't have easy answers, and your perspective matters. Now let's talk about what this case leaves behind. Because every disappearance creates an impact, not just on the people directly involved, but on everyone who hears the story. Christopher's case is a reminder that not all stories end with resolution, that sometimes the truth doesn't reveal itself, and that absence can be just as powerful as evidence. For his family, the impact never fades. It doesn't become easier. It doesn't become distant. It becomes part of daily life. A constant question that never gets answered. A story that never reaches its conclusion. And for investigators, it's a case that remains open. Not closed. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Waiting for something new. A piece of evidence. A confession. A discovery. Anything that turns uncertainty into truth. But until that happens, Christopher Kerze remains exactly what he has been for over 30 years. Missing. Not gone. Not found. Just missing. And that might be the hardest truth of all. Because it means the story isn't over. It's just unfinished. And now, before we end, there's something important you need to understand. The most shocking part of this case isn't just that Christopher disappeared. It's that he did it in a way that left behind a story, but no ending. He left clues. He left words. He left questions. But he didn't leave answers. And whether he planned that, or it happened to him, that mystery is what keeps this case alive. What keeps people talking. What keeps people searching. And what keeps his story from being forgotten. Because as long as there are questions, there is a reason to keep looking. There is a reason to keep asking. There is a reason to remember. So if you've made it this far, if this story stayed with you, then do one thing. Subscribe, because we cover cases like this every single day. Cases where the truth isn't simple. Cases where the system failed. Cases where the story doesn't end the way it should. Turn on notifications, because the next case might be the one that finally gets an answer. Comment your location below. Let's see how far this story reaches. And don't forget to answer those questions, because your voice is part of this conversation. And in cases like this, every perspective matters. I'll see you tomorrow, 7:30 p.m.